Has Washington weathered the storm in the transfer portal?
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes inside the Huskies of Fan Nation Sports Illustrated. I'm the site editor over with Huskies Wire. Make sure you check out all of our written work in their respective locations. And thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get 115 bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And also, make sure you get started by never missing an episode of the Locked On Huskies podcast by making sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and turning on notifications so you're always notified when we post a new episode. Now, Lars, we saw a really interesting outpour of support for Jedd Fisch and the Washington Huskies staff on social media this morning, and especially from a few really crucial players, especially, as the wear and tear on the roster continues to kind of show itself with guys taking visits elsewhere. And we're going to get into him a little bit later on the show. The only person who's entered his name into the transfer portal so far on Monday would be four-star quarterback Dermaricus Davis. I know you and I can't say we're surprised with, the way quarterbacking usually works in the transfer portal nowadays, but we're going to get to that a little bit later on. When you saw just kind of this outpour of support from guys like Zach Durfee, Jayvon and Armon Parker, Denzel Boston, Tristan Dunn, Deven Bryant being a couple of the other names, what was your just kind of first reaction to that?
I mean, it's not necessarily surprising, but it is a good reassurance, right? Because you would think for at least a decent amount of those guys, like this isn't a Colorado situation where you won 2 games or 1 game last year and you really need to turn over the roster and things like that. And again, the old coach leaves or gets fired. This is a situation where most of the good players left for the NFL or have gone into the portal. Most of the good players who are reserves have decided to stick around. And I think that's the key distinction, right? It's not that you're getting bad players to stick around. It's just like all the guys that didn't play this year, just there was 5th year and 6th year seniors in front of them. So there's no real chance for them to break through. But those are the guys that you need going into spring ball with a less than full roster. Even if you're able to get, let's say, 5 to 10 high school guys and maybe 3 to 5 mid-year enrollees that weren't already scheduled to be in. And you've already lost a couple, like David said, we'll talk about later. But getting some of those guys to stay in the boat now helps Fisch moving forward. And most of those guys, like the Parker brothers, like, okay, given how their recruitment went, like Michigan State didn't offer, Michigan didn't offer. If they went in the portal and Jonathan Smith offered, I don't know, that would just seem kind of weird. So it seems like a lot of the guys that are next up, especially on defense, but also on offense, like with Boston and those guys, they're all coming back. And I think the ones that have gone, we expected to go, right? Parker Brailsford, Jeremy Bernard, Colepo, Buelo, because guys that have 1 year left and you want to just go play somewhere else and do whatever you want to do. That's cool. But the rest of the majority of the young roster is intact. Like Deven Bryant's a key one for me because when you look at linebacker, you got Carson Bruner, Alfonso Chiputala, but after that, it's pretty thin. So that's why you want a Jordan Whitney, a Deven Bryant, guys like that are going to come in and probably have to play a little bit more than they likely would have. Now, we're saying that in late January, knowing that they will probably add some portal players at those positions in April and May. But until you get to that point, you can't. It's like winning. It's like buying a lottery ticket. You can't say, "Oh, hey, I'm going to have $1 million in May." Well, you might, but you can't really bank on that and say, "Hey, I'm going to now make all these plans and assumptions of what the roster is going to look like on potential."
So I like where you're going with this, and I want to just kind of add to it in 2 different ways. The first one being, I'm curious what this looks like for guys who maybe have entered the transfer portal but are still considering returning. How will, some of these guys maybe they'll be able to sell some of these players like, let's say, Landon and Garrett Hatchett, right? Maybe even a Nate Colepo and a Julius Buelow, some of these more experienced guys who would be a really big addition at a position of need. How might this, because it just looks like it was a team meeting or something, according to what Camden Sermon was posting on Twitter, where it was because one of the what he said was, yeah, I'm ready to run through a wall for Coach Fisch and the staff. Anybody who's in that meeting, I feel like they feel the same way. So it feels like it might have been a full team meeting, but whatever it was, it really did seem to get a lot of these guys to want to stay, even if they might not have been mulling entering the transfer portal anyways. Getting some of the other guys, another recent name who decided to, put out something in support would be Leroy Bryant, another guy who you and I are both really high on. And on top of that, we've seen some more veteran guys just kind of double down and say, all right, yeah, I'm going to be coming back, like Devon Banks and Cameron Fabikilanen. We're getting all these guys in the mix is great, and maybe you can use that to go out and re-recruit some of these other guys and say, you know what, pull your name out of the transfer portal. Yeah, you had fun on some of these visits. That's awesome. You got to go through that process. But remember why you came to Washington. Yeah, it's tough going through another staff change for, some of these guys like Julius Buelow and Nick Caleppo. But at the same time, we're all going to still be here, and it would be nice for you to pull your name out and just come spend your last season with us. And on top of that, another guy who you and I mentioned very briefly on the end of our Monday show is Noah Carter, where Jacob Saliga pointed out that it seems like Noah Carter is willing to come up for a visit and give the staff a chance before he makes a decision. It looks like he might take a couple others. We'll kind of see how that plays out. But with that, just being able to just say, all right, yeah, guys like Peyton Waters enter the transfer portal. We'll talk more about Dermaricus Davis, as we said, but seeing other members of that freshman class enter the portal or just be released from their NLI, finding a way to maybe get one or two of them back in the boat and starting with Noah Carter, top 100 recruit, really promising edge rusher, getting a guy like that to not only consider by taking another visit, but maybe finding a way to get him to commit again would be just absolutely massive. And I feel like the ball is starting to roll in the right direction with some of that momentum.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of it, and the other thing to consider is, and again, I'm not saying this is how Fisch is getting some of these guys, but as you see more of them start to pull their name out of the portal, to your point, they could still re-enter the portal in April. Just hey,
sure,
come back for spring ball. Just kind of give us a chance. Maybe for some of the guys who haven't gotten as much interest in the portal, say, hey, you know what? See if you can improve your stock a little bit. See if you can, if you're taking first team reps in spring ball, and then other schools will say, hey, maybe he's taking a next step. Maybe we want to look at him now, and then go back in the portal in May or June or April or May or whatever it is. Then that's a different discussion. But I do think, for the most part, there's some guys that know where they're potentially could go, like the Hatchets could go to Oklahoma, as you mentioned a couple of days ago, because they both had an interest from Oklahoma out of high school. So that makes sense. But some of these other ones, you're not going to see I don't know. I'm trying to think of it. You're not going to see an Elijah Jackson go to Nevada, right? Just to get playing time, right? You're not going to have those situations. Whereas before, coming off a 4-8 season in 21, there was a lot more potential for those guys to say, you know what, maybe I go look somewhere else, right? So now coming off a national championship with everything that Jedd Fisch is going to get to build on, there's a lot more of a reason to come back. And so I think once you're seeing more guys start to say, hey, I'll give him a chance, that momentum, to your point, kind of starts to domino, kind of snowball effect. And I think the more people start to meet Jedd Fisch and get to know him, that's where the recruiting and kind of his personality shines through, right? Because Kalen had that in a way where hey, he's a really chill guy once you get to know him. Jedd's he's a chill guy, but he's a fun guy, right? He's got that extra little bit of personality that guys I think are more drawn to, and that's kind of what the separator is in recruiting. We're hey, he's got the energy to do it. He's got the relationships to do it. He just needs people to believe in him. And coming off a 10-win season in Arizona when he won one game in 21, why not give the guy a chance? He's proven he can build, so just give him a chance. And if it doesn't work out, so be it. You can enter the portal later this year. That doesn't make a difference. So I think guys are starting to realize, hey, if I don't have that many great opportunities, I might as well stick with the great one I got now.
No, I completely agree with you there. And then I feel like that's a great way to just kind of move on into our next topic, because we're going to be talking about the wide receiver position. Jeremy Bernard obviously will be going elsewhere, but I know you and I are really high on some of the players in the room. But first, we're going to send a message to our good friends over at FanDuel. And hey, I got to give another shout out to the Lions, because after that fantastic game, playing the Niners, that's going to be tough for them. But I'm sure you can find some nice odds if you go look at FanDuel. Maybe we'll throw together a nice Lions parlay a little bit later in the week. because they've become the official team of Locked On Huskies here during their playoff run. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. The app is so easy to use. There's so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/locked on and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. So, Lars, let's move on to wide receivers, where you and I were both very, very high on Germie Bernard and what he would probably be bringing to the roster as after we saw, kind of a nice start. I feel like you can call it 2023 now with Rome Odunze, Jalen Millen, and Jalen Polk all moving on to the NFL draft. It seemed like he was ready to step into a wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 role after the commitment of Jeremiah Hunter, but he's officially, after entering the transfer portal, committed to Alabama, to probably no surprise there for most people who've been following him very closely for the last couple of years. Just wanted to follow Kalen DeBoer and Jamarcus Shepard to go down there, and that leaves this roster really, really thin at wide receiver. So really quickly, as of right now, these are the scholarship wide receivers on the roster: Jeremiah Hunter, Giles Jackson, Denzel Boston, Keith Reynolds, Rashid Williams, Jason Robinson, Justice Williams. And, there's still questions about Jeremiah Hunter when it comes to enrollment status, because he can very easily re-enter the transfer portal if he wants to, just, being somebody who committed to the old staff. We'll see how that all plays out. But that's really, really thin at wide receiver with a whole lot of youth. So I feel like we should just kind of start at the top here and then talk about how some of these guys are going to fill in, because we're going to have another discussion about the quarterbacks on the last part of the show here. But is there anything that really stands out to you about this group in particular, whether it be, the inexperience or the upside? Because there's a whole lot to talk about here with these guys.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some pieces that you like in the room. Obviously, a big fan of, why am I blanking on his name? The Williams, Rashid Williams. Yeah, I was like, I almost wanted to say Keith. I almost wanted to say Keith Williams. I'm like, no, it's not Keith. It's Keith Reynolds.
That's just a nice combo of the two guys.
Right, but Big Keith, right, man, could you imagine the speed of Keith Reynolds and the size of Rashid Williams? Like, man, that's a perfect combination. But to my point, you like the two young guys, and you like what Denzel Boston probably will bring as an emerging, I believe, redshirt sophomore.
Redshirt sophomore, yeah.
Yeah, so the key two are Giles Jackson and Jeremiah Hunter, right? Because Giles Jackson as a 6-year senior, Jeremiah Hunter as a transfer who came in, as you said, under the previous regime, but hasn't, unlike Will Rogers and others, Trey Watson already went to Texas A&M. So I feel like, and again, to your point, he still could enter the portal, still very much could enter the portal, but I think if he was pretty far gone, or if he was not interested in the new staff, he would have kind of followed the Trey Watson mold and dipped into the portal pretty quick after the new regime. So right. I think the fact that he didn't, and you have a Fisch coming up from Arizona, they're all on the West Coast. So it's not I got to get to know some of these guys. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know if Arizona recruited Jeremiah Hunter out of high school, but I would be surprised if they didn't, right? And you would kind of imagine, hey, this is a guy we definitely want to keep. And especially, if Giles does want to consider grad transferring, one of the two you got to keep. So you would imagine they'd probably keep Hunter because Keith Reynolds and Giles Jackson fill that similar role. But I think, honestly, I could see Giles sticking around, right? Because then, he's going to, and to your point about this thin room, he's going to have plenty of options, right? In terms of, getting targets and being a key contributor, whereas last season he had to play behind the 3 NFL receivers and even a couple other guys as well, and then he got hurt. So I think Giles is kind of better for him to stay, get maybe that unique Tyreek Hill role in this offense sort of thing, where he can just kind of get the ball in space and make something happen. And then Jeremiah Hunter being the deep threat. So as long as you can keep both of those two, then you can allow Denzel Boston to grow in that wide receiver 3, almost like in that Jalen Millen slot role, or fill the Jalen Polk role on the other side and put Giles in the slot. So you have plenty of options there. But the other thing that tells me is that means that Rashid Williams, Keith Reynolds, and some of the younger guys are going to get plenty of play. The curious one will be, does Jason Robinson and Justin Williams stick? Because if those two, which again, and so far they have, right? But it's one of those, if you can keep both of your freshmen and maybe add one more either in the portal or, a redshirt freshman from last year in the portal, that now you kind of at least have some depth moving forward, and then you can start to focus on the 25 class. Because right now you need probably 2 or 3 more receivers just to feel confident going into the season.
No, you're absolutely right there. And so I want to take a moment here to place one of my way too early predictions. I'm sure we're going to have a couple, but it's going to be a Denzel Boston breakout season. And that's the flag I'm going to plant as early as I possibly can here to get ahead of all this, because Lars, you and I really like what we saw from him in fall camp last year. It seemed like he might've suffered like a minor injury somewhere towards the end of that. And then, like we just talked about with Jeremy Bernard, playing behind 3 NFL caliber wide receivers isn't necessarily going to do anybody any favors. So didn't necessarily get a ton of run early on in the season. And that's after playing in the maximum amount of games as a true freshman in 2022, which kind of speaks to how much the previous coaching staff liked him and how high they were on him. So then moving forward, we didn't necessarily see a whole ton of him when, we expect him to maybe come in and be a big play guy where every once in a while he'd get a downfield target from Michael Penix. That didn't necessarily happen, but we saw it in fall camp. We saw everything that he's able to do. He's 6'3", he runs really well, he's a really good route runner, and he's got the ability to go up and high point the football. He has a really nice skill set that is definitely going to be needed in this offense. And as of right now, as we talked about this roster on January 22nd, which, is what we're going to do because that's what the show's all about, there's only one quarterback on the roster, and that's Demond Williams. So he's going to need somebody who he can trust to just throw the ball up and say, all right, I trust my guy, and he's going to come down and he's going to win it. I feel like that Denzel Boston might be able to be that guy. So I'm just curious to see how that's going to play out. And I feel like that's going to be one of the guys who I'm going to be watching really, really closely as, spring practice starts to creep up, as, we look in. Maybe Jedd Fisch will do something like what Kalen DeBoer did and have a couple of practices at the beginning of March. So when we look at that, I feel like that's somebody who I'm going to keep my eye on. And he's one of the people who did announce that he's going to be staying, that he's committed to the new staff and everything like that. So I thought that was really huge for the future of the wide receivers room, especially after the Jeremy Bernard transfer.
Definitely. And I would think, kind of in that similar mode, I could almost see Rashid Williams and Denzel Boston kind of both being breakout players. Denzel a little bit more so because he's a couple of years older, but they have so much similar skill sets. They both have similar body types. I mean, I believe Rashid can probably get a little bit bigger than Denzel, but having those two kind of similar NFL style receivers to go up, and no matter who you roll with, right? Whether it's Will Rogers, Demond Williams, or insert random third quarterback that we're not even talking about right now, you need to have the skill set on the outside. And I think that's what Washington has, and that's what's going to make it easier for the staff to recruit. And kind of teasing into the next segment, to sort out the quarterback situation. It's easier said than done, but it's easier to do that when you have skill on the outside. Now the real problem is going to be up the middle, right? Where do you have an offensive line to block those guys? So, but that's a different discussion for another day. But when you have the receivers, that's already half the problem, because then you can, when you're recruiting quarterbacks, you can look at them and say, hey, these are the guys you're going to be throwing to. Big body, fast, athletic, a different type of skill set. And then you got the tight ends as well with Josh Cuevas and maybe Ryan Otten emerges and things like that. So there's plenty of potential on this roster. It's just a matter of how quickly can this staff catch up where the scheme is to where the potential is. And then how can you fill out the roster, specifically a receiver, because they're going to need at least 2 portal receivers, and then you can probably take a third, maybe as a redshirt freshman or a younger player, maybe through the portal or in high school, whichever one they want to go with.
Right. And so real quickly, just because you talked about tight end a little bit, we want to give like the fastest transfer portal update that we possibly can, because we just got some new news as we're sitting here recording, and we want to, because we've seen it down in the YouTube comments like, oh, what about this guy? What about that guy? Where sometimes we're unable to record by the time certain news hits. So real quick update here before we move on to talk about the quarterback battle. Takario Davis, Dorian Thomas, and Kean Burnett are all staying in Arizona. They've all withdrawn their name from the transfer portal for the time being. And it looks like freshman linebacker Kamori House has also decided to put his name in the transfer portal, and kind of like somebody we're going to talk about with Dermaricus Davis, it doesn't look like he's ruling out Washington. He just wants to have that door open to look around a little bit. And Lars, with that being said, let's move into our quarterback discussion. So let's start with Demaricus Davis, because that's the big news of the day. Is Demaricus Davis has decided to re-enter the transfer portal. Guy who was a really late riser, was somebody that Ryan Grubb and Washington's offensive staff realized pretty early on, did a really nice job offering him early, staying with him, getting that final official visit, and earning his commitment. So he's somebody that I know you and I are both really high on in terms of his film, in terms of his arm talent. And, if he's able to bulk up, add a couple more pounds, what he might be able to be as a runner as well. But he's decided to re-enter the transfer portal. And like our little graphic here says for all our YouTube viewers, that just makes Will Rogers all that more important. If he does decide to go elsewhere, bringing back Will Rogers and maybe taking some pressure off of Demond Williams would be huge for this Washington staff.
Yeah, and I mean, so I think kind of the dynamic, and people, I think we even mentioned it a little bit, but people will say, well, Demaricus was going to come in with Austin Mack anyways, and potentially Will Rogers anyways. So why would he decide to leave? Well, when you have a new staff, when that new coach brings in his 24 recruit, it's a little bit of, okay, well, now you're taking kind of like how UW took Colson Yankoff and Jacob Sermon in the same class, right?
Sure.
Now again, the different situation a little bit, but usually when you take two quarterbacks in the same class, one of them is bound to transfer anyways. And you would have to be hard pressed to think Demond Williams would be the one to transfer out. First of all, because he would do that in a year or two from now. So you would think, okay, I guess Demaricus Davis could, right, kind of give it a shot, right, especially being a same mid-year enrollee. But I do think in terms of kind of the development of the room for Fisch, given that you got Demond Williams, I can at least see why both parties want to explore their options, right? Demaricus can see, hey, where could I go? Could I find another Power 5 school that I could maybe develop? And then, because obviously he's not doing this with the thought of, hey, I'm going to come in and play as a 5-star freshman, right? I mean, Julian Sayin just transferred from Alabama to Ohio State. But another Ohio State quarterback, Lincoln Kienholz, now is buried on that depth chart, right? So similar to Demaricus Davis, you don't want to be in that position to get buried. So there's a double-edged sword between leaving your current school, which you may or may not get buried, or going to find another school, which you may or may not get buried, or go to a lower school, which you won't get buried at, but now it's a lower level school. Like if you go to Southern Miss and play for 2 years, okay, cool. You played as a true freshman or redshirt freshman for a couple of years, but then you got to transfer again. And so it's a double-edged sword, but I think it's good for both Demaricus and UW to kind of see what their options are. And if Demaricus is able to find a different option, then I would imagine Fisch would go into the portal in later this spring and find maybe a redshirt freshman or redshirt sophomore, right? Where you kind of create a little staggered difference where you're still going to have Will Rogers. You'll still have Desmond Williams coming in March. But then you want a mid-year guy to say, hey, Will's probably going to be the guy. We want Demond to be the overall long-term guy. We're going to have somebody in the middle to make those quarterbacks. Because one thing we did learn under Ryan Grubb, and again, it's kind of known, right? But Ryan Grubb really explained it well, where you want to have at least 4 or 5 quarterbacks on your roster just to manage the arm reps, like in practice. You don't want Michael Penix throwing, 10,000 practice attempts before the season, because it's like, well, hang on, he's going to need some of that in the fall, where if you already know what you got, you don't necessarily want to burn his arm out. And so that's why, you take walk-on quarterbacks, you take, JUCO guys that are walk-ons and things like that, just to get some depth in that room. So I think that's probably going to be the route they go, right? Where if Demaricus ends up finding a different home, and he did have interest from other schools, so it's not out of the realm of, and he did get a bump from a 3rd to a 4th star. So clearly he's a good prospect. So the only hard part for him is going to be finding a school this late in the process. And I would be surprised if Alabama's that school because of Austin Mack, but maybe there's another school that emerges. Who knows?
So I like where you're going with that. And I want to touch on a couple things that you mentioned with that. The first one being the Colson Yankoff, Jacob Sermon thing, where, of course, we saw both those guys transfer elsewhere to play elsewhere. Obviously, Colson Yankoff not playing quarterback when he was at UCLA, playing tight end. But that's always the danger of taking 2 true freshmen in the same class, where we were kind of thinking that might be a case in 2025 if Jackson Pollock and Hassan Longstreet both ended up coming to Washington. So from that point, Demaricus' thought process is not incorrect, right? We're not saying like, oh, he should stick it out, he should try to win the job, any of those things, because I mean, because we still could see that happen. But on the other side of that, and kind of to that same point actually, but one of the schools that he also took an official visit to before he committed to Washington was Arizona under Jedd Fisch. So we could see him maybe either check out Arizona or just say, you know what? Yeah, I like the staff, been able to have a couple conversations with them now, and I'm willing to stick this out. I'm willing to see how this plays out for the time being. Where, maybe you see a battle between true freshmen, which is something we talked about on some previous shows. But then on the other side of that, it's just about finding ways to add depth no matter where it is, whether it be getting him back, getting Will Rogers, finding a transfer, finding a JUCO quarterback, maybe even like a Keinholz decides to hit the portal in the spring. We see that. There are a whole lot of different options that will be available. It's just a matter of, for the time being, we can only discuss what we see in front of us because the world of college football changes so often. There are so many different moving parts when it comes to coach changes. A couple ones may be coming here soon, which might help the Huskies out even more as the transfer portal kind of becomes a year-round event where there's interest from some NFL teams with hiring Chip Kelly. Maybe that opens a couple of doors. And let's see what happens with Jim Harbaugh in Michigan. He's got another interview with the Chargers. So there's a whole nother route right there and I feel like this goes beyond quarterback too, where it's all right, because the overarching theme of the segment is quarterback, but the theme of Washington's roster is finding depth and finding talent, where the quarterback is just kind of the microcosm and also just the highest level of needing to find that. So there are a lot of different options, and it's just a matter of, this is all we can say for right now, but there are a lot of different ways that this could play out. And I'm just really curious to see what the next step is.
Right. And I think another kind of comparison to make that UW fans will certainly understand is if Demaricus does kind of decide to go elsewhere, let's just take him out of the equation, right? So now you have Will Rogers potentially, because he is also in the portal, but has been sticking around the program and at least publicly hasn't taken any visits or made it clear that Washington is not in his plans to return. And then Damon Williams, it's almost a Jeff Lindquist, Jake Browning situation where you have not the incumbent starter, but you have a veteran. Now, again, Jeff Lindquist nowhere near the level of Will Rogers, especially as quarterback, right? But then you have Jake Browning as the freshman saying, hey, do we want this guy or do we want this guy? We're going to let him figure it out in fall camp. And I think that's where, even if you bring in a mid-year, like a JUCO transfer just to bounce the quarterback reps, you're doing that with the mindset of, okay, well, now we have 3 quarterbacks. We'll recruit 25 quarterbacks, so then we'll have 4 quarterbacks. We'll make it work, right? And we'll probably go for the portal guy next year just to balance out the numbers. But I think really you at least want 3, right? Because if
3 is the bare minimum.
Right, because if one gets hurt, regardless, you at least have one other one to fall back on. But the problem is with that, you don't want to have a fallback to Desmond Williams.
Jamal Williams,
or Damon Williams, sorry. If Will Rogers gets hurt or if something happens there, right? So, sure. But again, that also could play into the Noah Fafita role, right? Where, hey, now that Jaden Delora goes out, now Noah Fafita comes in and just kind of lights the world on fire. So there is ways in which it could work. It's just it becomes dicier and dicier the less bodies you have in that room. No different for receivers in the last segment, right? Where if Jeremiah Hunter has to miss a couple of games or Giles Jackson has to miss a couple of games, now all of a sudden that position looks a lot more than it does really promising, so that's why you just want to have those bodies in the room. Same thing with the offensive line, right? Where you talked about yesterday, where we had 10 offensive linemen. You really want that number closer to 20 than you want it to 10. And that includes walk-ons, right? So because you can have those, third team and scout team guys be walk-ons, at least in the spring, right? And make that work. But then as your program moves along, moving forward, you want those guys to be redshirt freshmen, redshirt sophomores, just so you have actual talent and experience in the room, and you're not just leaning on a bunch of guys that you got off of campus.
So you're absolutely right there. And again, it's always just put under more of a microscope when you look at it at quarterback, and that's why it's really curious to see how this plays out because, especially when we look at a guy like Damon Williams, his film is really, really impressive. Especially when you go back and you watch what he did at the All-American Bowl. He was fantastic. Just his ability with his legs is a whole nother thing, but he's also a really accurate passer. And the biggest question I feel like that a lot of people have with him is going to be his size. With Dermaricus Davis, there isn't that question where he's not necessarily, a super well-built guy, but he's got the frame to get there. And that 6'5" frame will take you a long way, especially, when you look at NFL scouts and you look at just kind of what the position of quarterback has turned into. But I'm just really curious see how it plays out between the two of those guys. You can throw Will Rogers in the mix. Maybe there's another name. Like that's why I threw out the Lincoln Kaiholtz name. Not that there's anything to that, but there's a certain possibility that we see something like that moving forward. And as we just kind of look at all the options that we see at quarterback, there are just so many different ways that it can go. And it's just a matter of not necessarily for Jedd Fisch of which route are they going to take. It's which route is going to win out. Is it going to be the experience and return of a guy like Will Rogers? Or is it going to be the youth and the upside of a Damon Williams or maybe even a Dermaricus Davis, where there are a lot of different possibilities, which is really interesting. And I feel like that's a good place for us to wrap up this one. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the everydayers tuning in. We really do appreciate your support because there's so much roster turnover. There's so much going on. We're doing our very best to make sure that you're updated with everything that goes on every single day. And like we said at the beginning of the show, if you want to make sure you're updated with everything that goes on, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere, updating this channel with new content every single day. Make sure you like the video, leave us a comment down below, leave us a 5-star review for audio only. That all really helps the show out a lot, and we really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Wednesday.